Dan Bongino effectively dismantled Maxine Waters with a single query, signaling the end of her era. The atmosphere within the House Judiciary Committee chamber felt dense, saturated with the smell of polished floors and the electric hum of numerous high-definition broadcast setups. Outdoors, the March rain coated the streets of D.C. in a slick metallic glaze. Yet indoors, the tension was palpably mounting. Maxine Waters smoothed the lapel of her crimson blazer, a color so vivid it appeared to pulse against the dark wood of the podium. She was 75, a 30-year veteran of these chambers, and she was acutely aware of exactly where the camera angles were positioned. She sensed the heaviness of the gavel in Chairman Jim Jordan's grip, even before he brought it down. The noise was piercing as it reverberated off the vaulted ceilings and the stern oil paintings of deceased legislators. This session of the House Judiciary Committee was now officially in order, Jordan declared, his tone efficient and abbreviated. He had performed this ritual countless times, yet there was a distinct vibration in the hall today, a predatory quiet. Seated by himself at the testimony table was Dan Bongino, looking nothing like the standard Washington official. No expensive attorneys sat beside him, nor were there public relations managers leaning over to murmur rehearsed evasions. He sat with a broad posture, a dense manila file lying on the desk resembling an armament. He tweaked the microphone stand with a hand that had spent years wrapped around a law enforcement firearm. When he finally spoke, his Queen's dialect was a rough instrument, unrefined and unapologetic. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Bongino stated, indicating he was ready to address whatever inquiries the panel might hold. Waters did not pause for official acknowledgement, nor did she wait for Jordan to conclude his introductory statements. She thrust herself toward her microphone, a motion so forceful it triggered a brief screech of audio feedback that made the aides in the front row flinch. "Mr. Chairman," Waters projected, her voice extending all the way to the rear of the audience gallery, "I intend to reclaim my time prior to even beginning, as I recognize this witness and his background. I am aware he will attempt to filibuster like every other Trump nominee who has occupied that seat and deceived the American populace." A ripple of mild disorder swept across the chamber, with a few Democratic members offering theatrical laughter. On the Republican aisle, there were distinct groans of annoyance, though Waters remained indifferent to the reaction. She was commanding the space, her gaze piercing behind her spectacles, focused and hunting. "The representative from California is granted 5 minutes," Jordan intoned, his voice tinged with an exhaustion implying he knew this routine by heart. "Thank you," Waters retorted sharply, donning her glasses with dramatic flair while glancing at her papers as if perusing a death sentence. "Deputy Director Bongino, let us be entirely precise regarding your identity. You are an ex-radio presenter, a Fox News analyst, and a sycophant for the former president. You have dedicated years to criticizing progressive legislators in this House, and you have disparaged the Black Lives Matter crusade. And now, inexplicably, you hold a position of command within the FBI." She leaned in closer, her finger extending like a javelin. "Has the Bureau under your supervision conducted probes into Black Lives Matter organizers in California? Yes or no?" Bongino did not recoil, having stood guard for heads of state. He had inhaled the atmosphere of the globe's most perilous chambers, and a congressional inquiry was merely a variation of noise. "Congresswoman," Bongino started, his tone unwavering, "we examine federal felonies. We do not examine ideologies. If a person committed a crime, the answer is simple. Yes or no." Waters's pitch ascended an octave, a jagged noise slicing through the quiet drone of the climate control. "It is a straightforward inquiry, Deputy Director. Do you possess a straightforward response? Or are you too occupied shielding your political bosses?" "I will provide a simple reply," Bongino retorted, leaning forward until the mic captured the gravel in his voice. "Yes We probed a self-proclaimed BLM coordinator in Oakland. Why? Because he reportedly stole over $4 million from a nonprofit intended for mourning households. Should we have permitted him to retain the funds, Congresswoman? Does his political activism grant him immunity from prosecution for fraud? Waters flicked her hand as though shooing a gnat. Deflection. That is the Trump strategy, and you are a mouthpiece, Mr. Bongino. How can you assert neutrality when you have spent years as a compensated advocate for the man who attempted to subvert our democracy? This was her typical method of operation, the Waters assault. Make the testifier defensive, make them emotional, make it about Trump, make it about race, make it about dominance. It had succeeded against bank executives, against cabinet ministers, and against the highest elite. But Bongino was not adhering to the screenplay. You are correct regarding one point, Congresswoman, Bongino stated, and the hall fell quiet. The reporters ceased their typing, and even the camera shutters appeared to decelerate their steady snapping. I was vocal, I held opinions, and I still do. But since we are discussing credibility, and since we are discussing who is worthy of wielding power, I have a query for you. I ask the questions here, Waters bellowed, yet the momentum was turning. The atmosphere in the chamber grew chillier, the smell of polish overtaken by the electric scent of the digital screens behind the podium. You have served California's 43rd District for 32 years, Bongino said, his voice lowering to a deep, steady rhythm. That is a significant duration, so tell me, during those 32 years, how many days annually do you actually reside in that district? Not campaign visits, not photo opportunities, but truly living there and witnessing what your voters witness. Waters's expression hardened as she perceived the snare. She noticed the manila folder on Bongino's desk and understood it was not a defense dossier but an accusation. I am not required to answer you, she whispered harshly. You are not, Bongino concurred, a slight icy grin gracing his mouth. But the American populace merits a response. Mr. Chairman, I wish to yield the rest of my time to factually address the Congresswoman's inquiries regarding my suitability for this role. Bongino rose and approached an easel positioned near the witness stand, draped in a white sheet. The sensory focus of the room altered, with the creak of his leather footwear on the stone tile being the sole noise in the void. You represent the 43rd District, Maxine, Bongino stated, removing the first sheet from the stand. Let us observe what that reality looks like. A map materialized showing South LA, Watts, and Inglewood, overlaid with bold crimson text displaying figures. Median income at $42,000, homeless count at 8,400, and violent crime at 847 per 100,000. These are your constituents, Bongino declared, 32 years of your advocacy for them, and this is the result. He removed the second covering to reveal a picture of a $6 million estate in Hancock Park with verdant grass, security barriers, 6 bedrooms, and 7 baths. This is where you reside, Bongino said, his voice slicing through the quiet like a blade. A palace in the 37th District, meaning you do not even wake up in the same postal code as the citizens whose ballots you gather. You represent destitution, Maxine, yet you live like royalty. Waters attempted to request a point of order, but her voice betrayed her. 52 million viewers were observing the split broadcast, the encampments in South LA on the left and the estate in Hancock Park on the right. The opening act had concluded, and the execution was commencing. Bongino allowed her no moment to respire, nor did he wait for a counter-argument. He reached into his manila file and withdrew a dense sheaf of stapled papers, elevating them so the lenses could capture the official government seals. Let us discuss how a civil servant on a state wage manages to amass a net worth of $6 million, Bongino said, his voice deeper now, a rhythmic grinding sound like gears meshing. Let us discuss your spouse, Sidney Williams, and a minor institution known as One United Bank. Waters's complexion turned a shade of pale that was nearly transparent. She attempted to adjust in her chair, but the motion was spasmodic and ungraceful. Her chief of staff leaned over the barrier behind her, whispering frantically, but she swatted at him to remain silent. That issue was resolved, Waters managed to utter, although her tone lacked its customary energy. The ethics panel dedicated 3 years to that, and I was exonerated. So this is ancient history, Mr. Bongino, and you are grasping at phantoms. I am not grasping at phantoms, Maxine. I am examining the ledger, Bongino countered. He returned to the easel and flipped to a fresh board. This one a timeline, stark and clinical. Dates were stamped in heavy black pigment, while specific events were highlighted in red. September 2008. Bongino narrated, his finger following the line, "The financial collapse is dissolving the globe. Your husband, Sidney, sits on the board of One United Bank, possessing $250,000 in their shares. The bank is floundering like a stone in a well, and your family's investment is nearing zero." He shifted his finger to the subsequent date, September 9th. Your office, Congresswoman, organizes an urgent meeting between Treasury Department leaders and One United executives. This was highly irregular, as the Treasury was submerged in pleas from the major banks, the too-big-to-fail group. They were not accepting meetings with small minority-owned banks from Los Angeles, yet they accepted yours. I was assisting a minority-owned enterprise, Waters yelled, slamming her palm on the desk. The smack of skin against timber resounded like a pistol shot. I was rescuing a pillar of the community. You were rescuing your husband's portfolio, Bongino snapped back, his Queen's dialect honing into a serrated edge. Because on September 30th, 3 weeks following the meeting you arranged, One United received $12 million in TARP bailout funds. That is taxpayer currency, my money. Their money, he said, gesturing toward the audience. He turned the page on the chart to a sequence of property deeds. And here is the clincher, Bongino continued. Between November 2008 and March 2009, while the citizens in your district whom you allegedly champion were being evicted by the thousands, you embarked on a real estate buying spree. While their residences were being foreclosed upon, you spent nearly $2 million in all-cash acquisitions with minimal financing, new properties and new wealth, all while the remainder of the nation was bleeding out. The camera operators were zooming in so closely that one could observe the tick in Waters's left eye. The split screen on the news channels was now a three-way view. The $6 million mansion, the homeless encampments, and the One United stock graph. The Ethics Committee determined that your grandson acted improperly in arranging that meeting, Bongino stated, leaning over the witness desk until he was inches from the mic. He took the blame, the grandson and staffer, but you are telling this panel and the 50 million viewers that you had no clue your husband's capital was at risk? You claim you just happened to arrange a $12 million bailout for the precise bank where your family's fortune was stored? Waters was trembling now, her hands rifling through her papers so rapidly they sounded like dry foliage in a gale. This is a hit job. I have devoted my life to this. You have devoted your life to the hustle, Maxine, Bongino interrupted, his voice a calm, devastating drone. Every single time there was a ballot that impacted the banks where your family had a stake, you voted for their benefit. It does not matter the year because the pattern remains identical. You utilize the impoverished as your shield and the banks as your ATM. He sat back down, taking a slow, measured sip of water, the click of the bottle cap sealing being the only noise in the room's void. You wished to interrogate me regarding my fitness for this position, Bongino asked, his eyes locking onto hers. I am an investigator, and currently the evidence indicates you are not a representative. You are a franchise. Dan Bongino did not wait for a defense. He reached into the thick manila folder and withdrew a series of FEC filings. These were Federal Election Commission records marked with highlighters so vivid the ink seemed to bleed off the sheet. "Let us move past the banks for a moment," Maxine, Bongino said, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial tone that compelled everyone to lean closer. "Let us discuss the family enterprise. Let us discuss Karen Waters." Waters clutched the rim of the podium, her knuckles white and the skin stretched taut over the bone. "My daughter is a professional. She is a consultant, and her work is legitimate." "Her work is lucrative," Bongino interrupted, keeping his voice level, which made the words feel heavier. "Between 2006 and 2024, your campaign funds, donated by people in South LA living in those tents we just viewed, paid your daughter over $1 million for Slate mailer services." "$1 million, Maxine, for mailers," he said as he rose and returned to the easel, flipping to a new display. This one was not a map, but a bar graph. On the left was a tiny bar representing the average income of a resident in CA 43, and on the right was a massive, towering column representing the payments to the Waters family. "Is it illegal to pay your daughter from your campaign?" Bongino asked, looking at the Republican side of the committee before turning back to the cameras. "Technically, no, not if she is performing the labor. But let us examine the labor. We have scrutinized the vendors, Maxine, and we have analyzed the printing expenses. Your daughter's consulting charge is frequently 30 to 40% of the total project cost. In the private sector, that is not a fee, that is a kickback. You are attacking a black woman's family." Waters' voice finally pierced the paralysis, but it was shrill, lacking its usual legislative gravity. "You are attempting to criminalize the success of my children because you cannot defeat me at the ballot box." "I am not attempting to criminalize success," Bongino countered, leaning his weight against the easel. "I am highlighting the poverty pimp business model. You go to Washington and scream about the struggle, you speak about the disenfranchised, then you accept donations from the very people you claim are struggling, and you use them to purchase a mansion in Hancock Park and $1 million lifestyle for your daughter." The sensory anchors of the room intensified, with a heavy glass of water on the chairman's desk rattling as a subway train hummed far beneath the building. The scent of the room was now a mixture of hot studio lights and the acidic smell of stale coffee. "My investigators spoke with 5 different consultants who work on California slates," Bongino said, retrieving a transcript from the folder. "They termed these payments extraordinary. They called them unprecedented. They stated that nobody in the state of California gets paid $1 million to manage mailers unless their last name is on the ballot." He walked back to the witness table and sat down, his movements slow and calculated. He lifted the water bottle, took a sip, and placed it down with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the absolute silence. "You call it representation, Maxine," Bongino said, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, predatory focus. "But 32 years later, the only people in the 43rd District who seem to be getting richer are the ones who share your DNA. Your daughter is a millionaire, your husband is a bank investor, and you live in a palace. Meanwhile, your constituents are still under blue tarps." Waters opened her mouth to speak, but her hand remained raised in a frozen, half-formed gesture. She looked at the cameras, then at the easel, and finally back at Bongino. For the first time in 3 decades, the Queen of the Resistance had run out of time. Dan Bongino did not look at his notes, for he did not need to. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking audibly in the silence, and looked directly at Maxine Waters. "You told this committee I do not know your district, Maxine," Bongino began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the mahogany tables. "You said I do not know your people. You said I have never been there. Well, you are correct about one thing. I do not live there. But for the last 3 weeks, my team has lived there. Not the FBI, but my private investigators paid for with my own money." He reached out and tapped a button on his iPad with a deliberate, heavy finger. The massive screens behind him flickered, then snapped into high-definition life. The footage was jarring, not the sanitized background clips usually seen in campaign commercials. It was a raw, unflinching drone sweep over the heart of the 43rd District. It was a landscape of desperation. "Look at it, Maxine," Bongino commanded, his voice narrating the devastation. The camera panned over rows of blue nylon tarps stretched for blocks under the looming concrete of the 110 freeway, flapping listlessly in the dirty wind. It zoomed in on shopping carts overflowing with scavenged possessions, pushed by people whose faces were prematurely aged by the sun and the streets. It showed abandoned storefronts with for-lease signs that had faded to a sickly yellow years ago. "This is the reality of 32 years of your leadership," Bongino said. The camera cut sharply, a jarring transition. Suddenly, the screens were filled with lush, green, manicured hedges, clipped into flawless geometric shapes. Palm trees swayed gently against a clear blue sky. A security gate gleamed in the California sun, guarding a sprawling $6 million estate. "And this is your reality," Bongino said. "Hancock Park, the 37th District. You do not sleep where they sleep, Maxine. You do not breathe the same air. You collect their votes like feudal dues, and then retreat behind a gate that costs more than most of your constituents earn in a year." "This is a stunt," Waters shouted, her voice cracking. She slammed her hand onto the podium, but the gavel remained untouched next to her. "You are using the suffering of my people as a prop for right-wing media. This is poverty pornography." "I am not using them," Bongino countered, his voice rising in volume but staying cold, controlled and rhythmic. "You are, for you have used them for 3 decades as a stepping stone to a mansion that is not even in their zip code." The sensory anchor of the room shifted, the hum of the air conditioning seeming louder now, a desperate attempt to scrub the tension from the air. The smell of the chairman's lukewarm coffee drifted through the stagnant space. "Are you sure my investigators did not just fly drones, Congresswoman?" Bongino asked, leaning forward until his face filled the monitors. "They walked those streets. They talked to the people living under those tarps. And do you know what they told us? They know your face from CNN. They know your voice from sound bites. But they do not know you. You are a ghost in your own district." "Because I am in Washington fighting for them," Waters yelled, leaning so far over the podium she looked like she might tip over. "I am the chair of the Financial Services Committee. I am doing the people's business." "You are fighting for the bank your husband holds stock in," Bongino interrupted, cutting her off with surgical precision. "You are fighting to keep the campaign cash flowing to your daughter's consulting firm. You are fighting for the status quo, Maxine, because the status quo made you rich while your district turned into a refugee camp." He paused, letting the drone footage loop back to the homeless encampment. It focused on a family, 2 adults and 3 children, huddled around a camping stove on a cracked sidewalk. Their shadows were long in the evening light. "Look at them," Bongino whispered, the sound carrying further than a shout. 32 years, Maxine. That is your legacy. You reclaimed your time. All right, you reclaimed it right out of their future and put it into your bank account." Waters sat back, the air seemingly leaving her lungs in a rush. The Queen of the Resistance looked suddenly, undeniably small against the backdrop of her own district's reality burned onto the screens above her head. The atmosphere in the room had moved past tense. It was now radioactive. The 52 million people watching were no longer seeing a political debate. They were witnessing a political suicide. The air smelled of ozone and hot plastic from the massive server racks powering the live stream. Outside, the DC humidity was building, but inside the air was as dry as bone. Maxine Waters did not sit down. She stood, her red suit a jagged streak of color against the dark wood of the committee room. Her hands were gripping the edge of the podium so hard the knuckles looked like white stones. She looked at the cameras, her eyes wide, searching for the familiar rhythm of the spotlight. She was a veteran of the theatrical, and she knew she was losing the stage. "This is a setup!" Waters's voice was a ragged scream now, a sharp, piercing sound that made the audio levels on the C-SPAN monitors peak into the red. "You are abusing your position. You are using the FBI to harass a sitting member of Congress. This is intimidation. This is harassment." Bongino did not move. He sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of Queens-born indifference. "It is public records, Maxine. It is hard to intimidate a spreadsheet." "Let us be very clear about what this really is," Waters shouted, her voice jumping an octave, her fingers shaking as she pointed it at Bongino. "This is racism. You are targeting me because I am a strong black woman who refuses to be silenced by your Trump-appointed thugs." The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. It was the nuclear option, the accusation that usually ended the debate, stopped the clock, and forced a retreat. The journalists froze, and the Republican committee members looked at each other, waiting for the fallout. The sensory anchor of the room shifted. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hiss of the ventilation system. Bongino stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a low, agonizing groan. He leaned over the table, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the base of the podium. "Don't you dare," Bongino said, his voice not a shout, but a low, vibrating hum. "Don't you dare play that card with me, Congresswoman," Bongino continued, his Queen's accent sharpening into a weapon. The working-class edge of his voice cut through the DC polish. "I grew up with nothing. My parents worked their fingers to the bone just to keep the lights on. I worked my way through college, taking night classes while working 40 hours a week. I have worn the uniform of a cop in New York, and I have worn the suit of a Secret Service agent." He stepped out from behind the witness table, moving toward the podium. The Capitol Police officers by the door shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their belts. "I have protected presidents of both parties with my life," Bongino said, his voice rising like a controlled, focused laser. "I have investigated corruption in both parties. I have gone after white politicians, black politicians, and Latino politicians. I do not give a damn about your race. I do not give a damn about your gender. And I certainly do not give a damn about your party affiliation. You are a mouthpiece for—" Waters tried to interrupt, but her voice was drowned out. "What I care about," Bongino cut her off, slamming his hand onto the easel next to the photo of her mansion, "is that your constituents who are black, who are brown, who are immigrants, deserve better. They deserve better than a representative who gets rich while they sleep on concrete. They deserve better than a leader who uses their struggle to buy $6 million real estate in a zip code she doesn't even represent." He was inches from the podium now. The cameras were zooming in so tight you could see the sweat on Waters's upper lip, the way her signature composure was disintegrating like wet paper. "So don't you dare hide behind identity politics," Bongino whispered, the sound carrying to every microphone in the room. "Don't you dare cry racism to cover up the fact that you have been robbing your community blind for 3 decades. The facts don't care about your skin color, Maxine, and neither do the people living in those tents." The room exploded. On the Republican side, members were on their feet, the sound of their applause filling the chamber like thunder. On the Democratic side, members were shouting for order, their voices a chaotic blur of procedural protests. Chairman Jim Jordan was banging his gavel, crack, crack, crack. But the sound was lost in the pandemonium. Through it all, Bongino stood his ground, arms crossed, staring directly into Waters's eyes. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smiling, he was just waiting. Waters looked at him, then at the cameras, then at the image of the tents on the screen behind her. For the first time in 32 years, the Queen of the Resistance did not have a comeback. She didn't have a slogan. She just had a $6 million mansion and 78% of a district that didn't know her face. "This hearing is in recess," Jordan shouted over the roar, but the recess didn't matter. The damage was done. The curtain had been pulled back, and the world had seen the reality behind the rhetoric. The hallway outside the hearing room was a claustrophobic tunnel of shouting voices and the blinding, rhythmic strobe of 100 camera flashes. Maxine Waters didn't walk. She was propelled by her staffers, a human wall of navy blue suits trying to shield her from the lenses. The air smelled of rain-slicked wool and the hot metallic scent of professional-grade video equipment. "Congresswoman, did you buy the mansion with one united money?" The questions were a physical weight, a barrage that didn't stop until the heavy doors of her private office slammed shut. Inside, the silence was absolute, but the light was still coming from the screens. Every television in the suite was tuned to the same image, the split screen. On the left, the high-definition drone footage of the Hancock Park mansion, $6 million of manicured perfection. On the right, the blue tarps and shopping carts of South Los Angeles. The text at the bottom was a white-hot brand. 32 years of representation. "It is at 60 million views," her communications director whispered, his face reflected in the glow of a tablet. "And that is just the raw clip of Bongino calling you a poverty pimp." Across the city at the FBI headquarters, Dan Bongino walked into his office and tossed the manila folder onto his desk. The thud was final, and he did not check the trends, for he did not need to. He could hear the sirens of the media circus through the glass. "They are calling it the Bongino reality check," an aide said, leaning against the doorframe. "Even MSNBC is struggling, as they have analysts trying to defend the slate mailers to your daughter, but the optics are radioactive." "It is not about the optics," Bongino said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl. "It is about the math, for you cannot argue with property taxes and bank ledgers." She brought a narrative to a gunfight. I brought the receipts. By 8 in the evening, the supernova had reached street level in the 43rd District, in the very neighborhoods Bongino had filmed. The air was thick with something new, not just the usual smell of exhaust and street food, but the sharp, acrid scent of betrayal. Community organizers who had spent 30 years defending anti-Maxine were gathered in church basements and community centers, staring at their phones. The nuclear option, the race card, had been played, and for the first time in history, it had been trumped by a drone shot of a manicured lawn. "She does not live here," a young man in a Watts Community Center said, his voice recorded on a viral live stream. "We have been voting for a ghost in a $6 million house while we sleep on the sidewalk." The media supernova was not just a news cycle, it was a realignment. The split screen had become the visual shorthand for an entire class of politicians. By midnight, the hashtag 332 years was the #1 trending topic globally. The Queen of the Resistance was still in her office, the red suit draped over a chair like a discarded flag. She watched the world she had mastered for 3 decades burn down in high definition. The morning after the hearing didn't bring clarity to South Los Angeles. It brought a heat wave that made the asphalt of Crenshaw Boulevard shimmer like a mirage. In a small, cramped office above a barbershop in Watts, Marcus Williams sat at a folding table watching the ceiling fan struggle to move the stagnant air. He was 34, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the very streets he'd spent a decade trying to fix. He wasn't a politician. He was a tenant rights organizer who still lived in a 2-bedroom apartment 3 blocks away. He watched the split-screen video on his phone for the 20th time. The mansion, the tents, the 3-decade gap between the two. "She is calling it a racist hit job," his campaign manager, A young woman named Tamika said as she dropped a stack of printed FEC forms on the table. She is already getting the press releases out and leaning into the Queen of the Resistance bit. She thinks the red suit and the Reclaiming My Time slogans will save her one more time. Marcus looked out the window at a homeless encampment across the street. A cluster of blue tarps and shopping carts huddled against a chain-link fence. "The slogans don't put roofs over heads," Marcus said, his voice a low, grounded baritone. "And they don't explain how you get a $6 million house on a $170,000 salary. The people around here are tired of being props for a national brand." He stood up, the old wooden chair groaning under his weight, and walked to the window. Feeling the heat radiating off the glass, he said, "People keep asking me when I saw her last, and I tell them the truth. I saw her in 2018 at a ribbon cutting for a library that closed 2 years later. She stayed for 10 minutes. The cameras caught her smiling. Then the black SUV whisked her back to the airport. That is not representation. That is a royal visit." By noon, Marcus had filed the paperwork. It wasn't a polished press conference at a hotel. It was a handheld live stream from the sidewalk in front of an abandoned grocery store. "My name is Marcus Williams," he told the camera, his voice steady even as the noise of a passing bus threatened to drown him out. "I am not running because I want a seat in Washington. I am running because the person who has that seat does not live here. She doesn't shop at this market, which is closed, by the way, and she doesn't see the kids doing homework by flashlight under the overpass. She lives in a mansion in Hancock Park, while we live in the reality she helped create over 32 years. The video didn't just go viral. It acted as a lightning rod for 3 decades of suppressed resentment. The water strike had always relied on the idea that attacking her was attacking the community, but Marcus was the community. He spoke the language of the rent strike and the after-school program, not the language of the cable news green room. While Waters' team scrambled to book appearances on MSNBC, Marcus was at the parks holding town halls on basketball courts where the nets were torn. He smelled the sweat of the people he wanted to represent: the construction workers, the single mothers, and the elders who remembered the district before the 32 years began. In Hancock Park, the atmosphere was different. The air was chilled by industrial strength, HVAC systems, and scented with expensive jasmine and lavender. Maxine Waters sat in her library, a room filled with leather-bound books and awards from a lifetime of service. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the soft ping of her phone as the polling numbers began to slide. "He is a nobody," her chief of staff argued, pacing the Persian rug. "He has raised $80,000. You have $4 million in the bank. We will drown him in ads. We will link him to the Republicans. We will tell the voters he is a Bongino puppet." Waters looked out her window at the security gate, where she could see the gardener trimming the hedges into perfect silent spheres. "He is not a puppet," she said, her voice sounding older and thinner. "He is a mirror, and for 30 years I have made sure there were no mirrors in the 43rd. I gave them a window into the resistance instead. I gave them a hero to watch on TV so they wouldn't look at their own streets." She stood up, her red suit jacket feeling heavy and restrictive. The sensory anchor of her world was the silence of luxury, a silence that was now being haunted by the footage of the tents and the shopping carts. If they start looking at the mirror, the money won't matter, for the queen doesn't survive if the peasants realize she is living in a different kingdom. By the end of the first week, Marcus Williams' campaign had raised $500,000. It wasn't large checks from bank lobbyists. It was $5, $10, and $20 donations from people who had never given to a politician in their lives. They weren't just buying a candidate. They were buying a way out of a 32-year-old story. The House Ethics Committee room was a sterile, windowless vault designed to strip away the theater of politics and replace it with the cold, hard math of accountability. Representative Waters sat at the far end of the table, having traded the aggressive red suit for a somber navy blue ensemble. Across from her sat the lead investigator, a man named David Arrojo, whose face was as expressive as a tombstone. "Representative Waters," Arrojo began, his voice a flat clinical drone. "We are here to discuss the preliminary inquiry into your financial disclosures from 2008 to the present." He slid a document across the table, the paper heavy, and the ink still smelling fresh. "Specifically, we are looking at the nexus between your legislative actions on the Financial Services Committee and the private investment portfolio of your husband, Mr. Sidney Williams." "I have already explained this," Waters said, her voice sounding thin and stripped of its usual resonance. "I was concerned about minority-owned banks during a national crisis, and my family's involvement was a coincidence." "Coincidence is a difficult defense when it happens 4 times in a decade, Congresswoman," Arrojo countered, not raising his voice, which made the words feel heavier. The investigation had expanded beyond the banks to the Slate mailers and the $1 million funneled to her daughter Karen. "We have received over 4,000 letters from the 43rd District in the last week alone," Arrojo said. "They aren't asking us to silence you. They are asking us where the money went." The hearing adjourned for the day, but the exit wasn't a triumph. Waters walked out into the private corridor, the silence of the building feeling like a weight. She looked at her reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors and looked like a ghost of the woman in the red suit. She reached her office and saw her nameplate on the door. For the first time in 32 years, it didn't look like a title. It looked like a target. The heat of the June primary in South Los Angeles was a physical entity, a thick, shimmering weight that tasted of salt and diesel. On the corner of Crenshaw and Slauson, Marcus Williams stood on a crate. His voice was unamplified but cut through the roar of the morning traffic like a hacksaw. He wasn't wearing a $600 suit. He was in a faded polo and jeans, his skin glistening with the honest sweat of a man who actually walked the pavement. By 11 at night, the Associated Press called the race. The 32-year dynasty had ended not with a grand legislative battle, but with a landslide in a primary. Marcus Williams walked onto the small stage in the community center. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in the same polo he'd worn to the town halls, the fabric dark with sweat. "Tonight," Marcus said, his voice a low, grounded rumble, "we didn't just win an election. We reclaimed our reality." In Hancock Park, Maxine Waters stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the manicured lawn. She realized then that Bongino hadn't destroyed her. He had simply held up a mirror, and the 43rd District had finally looked into it. The Queen was gone, but the people were finally, undeniably, home.